But I think the court has to make some findings as it relates to the bad faith on the part of the prosecution. And if the court makes a finding that the actions that I had talked about.
Shadowley.
Then I think both elements for mistrial with prejudice have been met. And I think under
With prejudice, meaning that they cannot retrial.
The court to consider those, and I would ask that the court grant the motion with prejudice. Thank you.
Thank you. State?
Your Honor, I would like an opportunity to more fully respond to this in a little research. At first blush, though, I reserve the right to present case law and additional cites to the court. But I do want to point out for the record that the defendant has presented interviews to at least one media source and at least one online source since his arrest. And there have been questions about that night. There have been questions about what he did, things like that.
They cannot
decided, on advice of counsel in those circumstances, not to give a statement in the media about what happened. But he is talking about his family life, he's talking about his friends, he's talking about the circumstances of the case, he's talking about how this has affected him and things like that. So my point in asking those questions was, you have agreed to talk to the media, you've agreed to talk about yourself, you've agreed to get interviews, but until now, this is the first time you're explaining your actions. And so I wasn't referring to his in-custody statements. In fact, I never asked either detective about what the defendant told them. He actually
is the prosecution defending itself right now? Is the prosecution defending itself right
I
now?
want to talk to my lawyer, and they're like, okay, we're done. So I'm not referring to that. I didn't ask.
I'm not referring to that.
About that. But since this, the defendant has spoken to the media. He has talked about his life, about circumstances related to this case. He just hasn't given his exact version of events that night. So his voluntary discussion to speak to the media has nothing to do with the Fifth Amendment. That is his own decision. And if he's going to pick and choose what he wants to talk about in those voluntary interviews with the media, then I think that's
Pick and
okay.
choose. If he's going to pick and choose what he wants to talk about during those voluntary interviews.
Give an interview about his
Judge.
he won in high school, or his demerits that he got, or his and about his sports activities and his swimming and that, and declined to answer any questions about the incident in question, and that somehow a waiver of his right of silence?
I think he's doing more than that, Your Honor, in these interviews.
I think.
I haven't seen.
Cook.
Oh,
I think.
haven't seen probably 1% of all the evidence, which is pretty typical, as you know. So I have no way of knowing it. And you have some interviews that he gave to media or to whatever.
Yeah, there's an interview that I'm looking at our computer right now from the Washington Post.
From the Washington Post.
I know there's one. I think it's either the New Yorker or the GQ magazine where he speaks to the reporters also. And he doesn't go into specific details about what happened that night, but it's not like it's talking about school or swimming or things
Well,
like that.
no. Don't leave it at. He doesn't go into specific details. I mean, it's certainly there could be a waiver, but a very modest discussion about the activities of that night. And if you're suggesting that occurred, that could make a big difference. But even a small discussion on his part of the night in question might be a full waiver. I don't know, but I won't know until I see it. But why don't you make copies of it and.
Can we have a few minutes to
Well, we won't do it right now. I do agree with you that this is not something that I would want to do sitting here without giving you an opportunity to respond.
That basically,
Although I would be
that goes
interested in your
into
response
Chambers
to,
talk.
The excluded evidence that you touched on after having been told not to do this, or having been told that I was confirming my prior rulings.
I do want to just point out right now, we've got it on the screen. This is a Washington Post article, and there's reference to an interview that he says, the defendant says, he did not regret having his gun because, quote, I would have died that night if I didn't, end quote. So that's a direct quote from the defendant to the media about that night.
What about that?
Your Honor, all I can say about that interview is there were prior counsel representing him.
I don't care about that.
And I believe it was a telephone interview. I don't know anything about the circumstances of that. I'd have to read the article.
Well, that might make a difference. And what about the
Judge just winked at the prosecution.
asking questions about excluded evidence?
Your Honor, we went over this earlier, and I
Or-
don't repeat myself because I know you've heard me.
Pardon me, the camera's flipped. The defendants.
I did hear you talk about that evidence this morning before testimony. The defendant then took the stand. He admitted that he had said to the person in the yellow pants that he had pointed a gun at that person. I have seen that video. It was actually introduced by the defense. I think it was even in their opening statement. And
The prosecution
person who confronts
went
the defendant accuses him of this.
on
Frankly, to be honest,
the
Your Honor,
court
when I
of
watched the
popular
video the first
opinion.
time, I didn't hear the defendant's reaction. I thought it was someone.
Sorry, maybe I should get a little
and the
closer.
defendant walking away as
The
if
prosecution is working with the court of public opinion.
to hear the defendant admit in his testimony, on direct, by his attorney, that yes, I did tell that person that I had pointed the gun at them. He explained then that he was joking when he said that. The jury can evaluate that. It goes to his credibility, it goes to whether or not he's telling the truth, it goes to his decision making.
This is-
Again, this is an incident that occurred that night, so it's not something that happened separate in time. It presumably happened a few minutes before. But like I said, I was taken aback.
And Danny
by the
boy.
defendant admitting that he had said to this person, yes.
Doesn't mean gay.
And I think it's fair to say that
I think,
watching that person,
Like,
believes
I
strongly that
believe,
this happened, the defendant is telling him that happened. Now the defendant today is giving us a different version and saying, oh, I made it, I was joking, I was just kidding that guy or whatever. I'd
whatever.
like to probe that. I'd like to probe what he said to that person. I'd like to probe what his motivations were, etc. I'd like to probe whether, in fact, he really did do that. And I think that changes
Judge.
the equation with regard to the CBS video that was the subject of the other acts motion. Because in my mind,
CBS.
it's very similar. And I know we've disagreed on that, and I'm not going to belabor the point, Your Honor, but that was where I was coming from, was there's been a change in the testimony of the defendant today that I think makes that evidence it's admissible and much more relevant than it already was.
They're fighting.
It was already-
The prosecution is fighting to keep the case alive.
So I'm just here on the sidelines, just
Well, you.
yeah, I had made a ruling that the evidence wasn't coming in, and you decided that it was.
If I could just respond to
Excuse
that
me.
briefly, Your Honor, I was about to say, I did not interpret your ruling as an absolute. We've had 3 state motions in this case. There was one in which we asked the court to introduce evidence that the defendant was at Pudgy's bar with Proud Boys, and you were clear that is not coming in. There was.
You know, don't get into other subjects. Come on, what you're telling me, you're an experienced trial attorney, and you're telling me that when the judge says, I'm excluding this, you just to take it upon yourself to put it in because you think that you've found a way around it? Come on.
If I may finish, Your Honor, I was about to say, your ruling on our 3 motions and other acts motions was, there were some gradations there. That you were clear that some things were absolutely out, and then you left the door open on other things.
I know.
So I saw that distinction, and I thought to myself, clearly I know this is out, but you left the door open on other things. So I didn't interpret your ruling as this is absolutely never coming in. And I have practiced before you, Your Honor. I have filed other motions before you. Your practice oftentimes is to reserve ruling on those until you see the evidence. And
Oh, now you're trying to tell.
Undoubtedly did.
So I thought, this is my good faith explanation to you, and if you want to yell at me, you can. My good faith feeling this morning after watching that testimony was you had left the door open a little bit. Now we had something
I will
new,
keep
and
my
I was
back
going to-
straight when I get my ass kicked. When I get my ass kicked.
Take the motion under advisement. And you can respond. When you say that you were acting in good faith, I don't believe that, okay? Let's proceed. Everybody in good faith. All right.
God bless America
Would you come up, please, Mr.
and
I do have,
the world.
Yeah.
Your Honor,
Yeah.
I do have another item
Whether
that
it's
I
my
want to
God,
raise
your God, our God.
before the jury comes in and raise it with you.
Just one more thing.
There was
If you don't mind.
the defendant being at Pudgy's bar after a court appearance in January, in which he poses for selfies
January.
wearing a shirt that says "free as fuck." I would like to ask the defendant if he posed for selfies after a court appearance with members of the public wearing that shirt. I do not intend to talk about who those people were,
First
what groups they were affiliated
Amendment.
with, or anything along those lines. But
Using
I
a
believe that it is
shirt.
relevant.
Just like the fucking Democrats are trying to use a fucking meme right now.
Wearing a shirt like that. I think it is relevant to some of the issues that have come up in this case. For example, is remorse or lack of remorse, is utter disregard for human life. Those are things that I think it comes into play, because I think that behavior is not consistent with someone who has a regard for human life. The jury has already watched him break down on the stand with emotion. I'd like to probe how heartfelt and sincere these emotions are when you go
Damn
to
right
the
you
bar
like to probe.
and pose for selfies with
Huh.
people. When you're out on the
I don't
bond
get enough,
in a
bro.
first-degree intentional homicide trial wearing a free as fuck shirt. So, as I said, I want to use the photograph. I'm not going to talk about any of the people or who they were from. In fact, the photograph I'm going to use has actually got their faces blocked out, so we won't see any of the people in the crowd. We'll just see the defendant standing with a group of people for a selfie with that shirt on. That's as far as I want to go.
Handle this issue.
Nobody got an opportunity. First of all, you've made a ruling on it, and it was clear prior to him testifying. So part of this is, would we have raised it? Would we have brought it up if we would have known that it was going to be coming in? We have done there's been nothing to open this door, Judge. Nothing that has been said to open the door about what happened 4 months after this is relevant in any way to what happened that evening. That is part of what the court had ruled. You had said 4 months after, I don't see how that goes to any 90404 type of admissible evidence. So my argument is, A, you ruled on it previous to him testifying. You confirmed your ruling, which you had made previously, where Mr. Binger just said you had shut the door on it. So apparently he doesn't believe a door that is shut should stay shut. However, now he's asking that something be admitted that, to be fair, this should have been brought up sooner. This jury, I did the voir dire, I would have voir dired on an issue of whether or not they heard it, saw it, were aware of it. How they felt about it, whether it had an impact on their ability to be fair in the case. We never went there because
This is the defense.
So there's nothing that's opened this door, and I don't think it's relevant to something that happened 4 months later. He talked about indifference to human life. That's that night, not 4 months later. There's nothing that's relevant about that. You've already made your ruling. I ask that you stick with it.
I'm struggling with why it would be relevant to any of the issues in this case. If he were on trial for using exquisitely bad judgment, if he were on trial for behaving in a very offensive way, then I could see the purpose. But an incident that occurred 4 months after the incidents in question, I don't see how that jury can work with that in reaching any conclusions about the issues in this case.
First of all, Your Honor, we have introduced evidence that the defendant had a slogan on his TikTok page, "Bro, I'm just trying to be famous." This case has made him famous, and he's posing for selfies as a result. One of our theories of this case is that his behavior that night was intended to gain attention, to be famous, and he's reaped the benefits of that. Second of all, he is on trial, in my opinion, for exquisitely poor decision-making. Taking a gun that he's not legally entitled to have, coming down in violation of curfew, running around the community with that gun, trying to be a police officer when he's not, confronting protesters that he knows are hostile, and all of those behaviors, I think, are exquisitely bad judgment. So the jury can make that decision. The jury can give what weight they want to this evidence, but it's moments after he has a court appearance here. He's out on bond in this case when he decides to do this behavior, and nobody made him do it. Nobody forced him to go to the bar. Nobody forced him to wear the shirt. Nobody forced him to pose for selfies. It's his own decision making.
When I made reference to exquisitely poor judgment, I was talking about at the incident.
The defense is barely spoken.
Because
That's what you know.
Everybody
It's in favor
all
of the defense.
Humanity, at one time or another, displays bad judgment, sometimes exquisitely bad judgment, and we don't let it into people's trials on unrelated matters. So I wasn't referring to his having had good or bad judgment on the day in question. That's a legitimate inquiry, and you're being allowed to present a lot of evidence on that subject. And the jury is going to be instructed in some of the element of some of the crimes that are charged here is going to deal with the caliber of his judgment. But you're talking about an incident that occurred 4 months later. So I'm not saying it, and I don't want to waste any more time with it. I don't think so. I've ruled before it's not admissible, and I've heard nothing to change my mind about that.
It was sought to be admitted earlier for a different purpose, Your Honor. I'm sorry? It was sought to be admitted earlier for a different purpose than it is today. The court was ruled that it can be admitted for the prior purpose, but I'm seeking to introduce it for a different purpose today.
And that request is denied.
Thank you.
Okay? Are you ready to go?
And so they muted the entire court. But it's been ruled mistrial for Kyle Rittenhouse, motherfuckers.